The wagon came down into the valley on a morning in late April, when the sky was the pale, uncertain blue of a thing not yet decided. The road, if it could be called that, was little more than two ruts pressed into the hillside by whoever had passed this way before, and the grass between them was already beginning to blur the lines. By the time the horses reached level ground, the woman on the bench was holding the edges of her coat closed against a wind that smelled of snowmelt and open distance, and the man beside her had gone quiet, in the way men do when they are seeing something for the first time and measuring it honestly. The valley was wide and shallow, cupped between long ridgelines that ran roughly north to south. A creek threaded the bottom of it, fed from the hills, and the land on either side was the kind of flat that looks gentle from a distance and reveals its stubbornness only when you kneel and press your fingers into it. The soil was thin over clay. Anyone who had farmed long enough would have recognized that immediately. She recognized it. The cabin stood near the eastern edge of the claim, set back from the creek by maybe 200 yards. It had been started by someone with good intentions, and interrupted by whatever life does to good intentions. 3 walls were solid enough, rough-hewn logs chinked with dried mud, but the 4th was half-finished, open to the weather, and the roof needed work before it could be trusted with rain. Beside it, a small barn leaned slightly south, in a way that suggested argument with the prevailing wind. There was a root cellar mounded into the hillside behind the cabin, its door hanging on one leather hinge. They sat on the wagon bench for a moment without speaking, not from despair. They were not people given easily to despair, but from the particular kind of quiet that comes when the reality of something lands fully and you are simply letting it settle. Then she climbed down first. She walked toward the pond before she walked toward the cabin, which told him something, though he could not have said exactly what. It lay perhaps 150 feet south of the barn, roughly half an acre of still, dark water, held in a natural depression in the earth. It was fed, as they had been told, by a cold underground spring. In April, it had not yet found its summer character. What covered it now was the wreckage of the previous season, brown stems and collapsed lily pads pressed flat against the surface, the whole thing looking less like a pond and more like something that had given up. She stood at its edge for a long moment. He came up beside her and looked at it too, the matted stems, the cold dark water showing in gaps between, the still bare mud of the near bank. "Needs clearing," he said, not unkindly. She didn't answer right away. She stood there a little longer, and he let her, because he had learned early in their marriage that she thought in a particular rhythm, not slow exactly, but unhurried, like water finding its own level. Then she turned and walked back to the cabin without saying anything at all, and he stood alone at the edge of the pond another minute, looking at the wreckage of last season pressing flat on the dark surface. He made up his mind that evening, not harshly, not in any spirit of conquest, simply as a practical man looking at a practical problem. They had 160 acres and a first growing season ahead of them, and the ground that pond sat on was good, gently sloped earth that would drain well and hold grass. He ran the figures in his head the way he always did, quiet arithmetic beside the fire, the time it would take to cut the berm, let the water out slowly, let the ground dry through summer, seed it in early fall. By the following spring, they'd have a third more grazing. A man could do worse. He told her his thinking before they slept, plainly and without pressure, and she listened just as plainly, lying in the dark with her eyes open. "All right," she said, and then, "Give me till the end of the week." He wasn't sure what she meant by that, but he agreed. She went to the pond each evening that week at dusk. He watched her from the barn door once, not to spy but because the light was good and she made a still figure against it, standing at the water's edge with her skirt hem darkening in the soft mud, looking down. He went back to his work. On the 4th evening, she came in later than usual and set a wet hand on the table before she took off her coat. In her cupped palm was a small fistful of mud. "Come feel this," she said. He put his hand in it. Cold. Uncommonly so. A cold that didn't belong to the April air, which was mild enough. A cold that came from somewhere deeper than the surface. "The spring," she said. "It's strong. Stronger than I expected. The water wells up right under the roots. You can see it moving if you watch the stems." He looked at the mud in her hand, then at her. "That water stays cold," she said carefully, "even when the summer turns hard. I don't know what that means yet for the pond, but it means something." She paused. "It costs us nothing to wait one season and see what it does." He was quiet a moment, turning that over. She wasn't asking him to abandon the plan. She was asking him to hold it one season in his open hand, rather than close his fist around it. There was a difference, and he felt it. "One season," he said finally. She nodded and set the mud back outside on the step. 3 weeks after that, they got the ducks. It happened the way most good things happened on the frontier. Sideways, without announcement. A wagon family came through the valley on their way north. Axle dust gray and road-worn, the husband walking beside the team with a limp that told its own story. Their front left wheel had a cracked rim, the iron worked loose and threatening to give entirely on the next rough stretch of ground. He pulled the wagon off the track and asked at the cabin if anyone knew ironwork. He did. Not a blacksmith by trade, but competent. He'd learned to be. The way frontier life insisted a man learn most things, out of necessity rather than choice. He looked at the rim, looked at his tools, and told the wagon man he could set it right by morning. The wagon family camped near the barn that night. The wife cooked supper over their own fire and brought a pot of something hot over, as a kind of thanks, and the two couples sat together in the early May evening while the rim cooled in the grass. When talk turned to payment, the wagon man gestured toward the back of his rig, where a slatted crate held 11 Muscovy-type ducks, big, quiet birds with dark plumage and pale faces, more accustomed to sitting still than making noise. He'd picked them up in trade 2 settlements back, and found them more burden than benefit on the road. Would they take the birds instead of coin? They would. By the following morning, the rim was set, the wagon was rolling, and 11 ducks were standing at the edge of the pond with an air of cautious evaluation, the way any creature looks at something new before deciding to trust it. They didn't hesitate long. Within an hour, the first one had slipped off the bank and under the lily pads, diving into the cool shadow beneath the broad leaves, as naturally as though it had always known to do exactly that. The others followed in their own time, each one finding the shaded water beneath the canopy and settling into it with visible ease. She watched from the bank for a long while, longer than she'd meant to. She'd expected the ducks to treat the lilies as an obstacle, something to push through or avoid. Instead, they moved among the stems like the pond had been arranged for them. The pads overhead cut the glare. The water below stayed cool and clear. The birds dove and surfaced, preened, and dove again. She couldn't have explained precisely what she was watching for. She only knew that something was fitting together in front of her, like a dovetail joint that had been cut in 2 different places and only now was meeting properly. She didn't say this out loud. There was nothing certain enough to say, but she stayed at the water's edge until the light shifted and the ducks began settling in the shallows, and she walked back to the cabin, already thinking about what she would need to build a proper shelter for them before the nights turned cold again. The shelter came together in the 2nd week of May. A simple lean-to of split pine lashed against the south wall of the barn, low enough to hold warmth but open at one end to give the birds a clear line to the water. He'd watched her sketch it out in the dirt with a stick and hadn't said much, only gone to find the right timber. That was the way they worked, she thought out loud in the ground. He made what she drew. By the time the cottonwoods along the creek had leafed out fully, the ducks had claimed the lean-to as their own, and the pond had begun its slow, annual filling in. By June, the lilies had spread, until they covered better than 2/3 of the water's surface. Standing at the bank in the early morning, you could barely tell there was a pond beneath. Only the occasional shimmer between stems, the low murmur of the ducks moving through the pads, and the faint mineral smell of cold water rising through warmth. From a distance, it looked less like a pond than like a green field that happened to be wet. She thought it was beautiful. She'd stopped apologizing for that, even to herself. He was mending the east fence line that afternoon when he heard the horse. He didn't look up right away. Riders came through the valley often enough, freighters and homesteaders cutting toward Cartwell Crossing, nobody slowing for long. But this one slowed. He stood and turned and recognized the horse before he recognized the man. A big roan, well kept, belonging to Aldous Birch, whose land ran along the northern ridge, and who had made no secret, in the months since their arrival, of his opinions about what the valley required of the people who settled it. Birch pulled up at the fence line. He looked toward the pond for a moment without speaking, and his expression said enough before his words did. He told him flatly, in the way a man tells another man something he believes should already be obvious, that any serious farmer would have drained that swamp by now. Said it wasn't doing the land any favors sitting there under a mat of weeds. Said it was drawing mosquitoes. Said the acreage could be put to proper use. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The words were measured and certain and delivered like something final. He stood with his fence pliers in his hand and said nothing. There wasn't a clean answer available to him. Nothing that wouldn't sound like excuse-making. Nothing that would have satisfied Birch anyway. So he nodded once, and Birch rode on, and the sound of the roan faded back up the ridge. He turned toward the pond. The ducks were working through the lily stems in the afternoon shade, unhurried. The water between the pads caught the light and held it. He stood there for a moment, then bent back to the fence wire, jaw tight, saying nothing to anyone. The heat came in July like something with weight to it, pressing down on the valley from above and rising back up from the baked ground below, meeting in the middle until the air itself felt thick. The creek that fed the lower pastures dropped to a trickle by the second week. The grass yellowed fast and lay flat. Even the mornings offered little relief. The sun cleared the eastern ridge, already hard and purposeful, and by midday, the cabin walls held a warmth that didn't leave until well after dark. She noticed the difference at the pond first, the way she noticed most things, quietly, without announcement, standing at the water's edge with her apron gathered in one hand and watching. The lily pads had spread further than they had in the weeks before, and where they covered the surface, the water beneath them sat in cool shadow. She knelt and drew her hand through it, cold enough to surprise her, not merely cool, genuinely cold, the way the root cellar was cold, the way the spring ran cold, even in August. The underground source was still feeding it steady and deep, and the lily canopy above was holding that cold in like a lid, refusing the July sun any purchase on the water below. She stood and looked at the flock. They were working along the shaded margins, unhurried, as they always were, dipping, preening, moving through the stems with that low, quiet industry that had become the steady background music of the place. They looked well. They looked, she thought, better than well. Their feathers sat tight and clean. Their eyes were alert. They moved without the listless drift she had seen in heat-stressed animals. She began to pay closer attention after that. Word came down from the Marston place, 2 ridges over, that they had lost 4 birds in a week. The open pond there had gone rank, a thick green film across the surface, the water beneath it warm and still. She heard it from a woman at the Cartwell Crossing dry goods counter, told matter-of-factly, the way losses were told on the frontier, without drama, but with a certain weight behind them. The Haverfield family, further east along the valley floor, had lost 3 more. Their stock pond had turned by midsummer, choked with algae bloomed up fast in the heat, and the birds that drank from it had sickened. She stood in the store aisle and listened, and said nothing except a few quiet words of sympathy, and walked home turning it over in her mind. That evening she went back to the pond alone. The sun was low, and the lily pads caught the last of the light across their broad, flat surfaces, gold at the edges and deep green at the center. The ducks were settling. The water between the stems ran clear enough to see the bottom. She didn't say anything to him that night. She was still thinking, but something was beginning to take shape in her, something like certainty, arriving slowly, the way the best kind does. She started counting the next morning. It wasn't something she had done before with any real precision. She had kept a loose mental tally, the way most homesteaders did, glancing at what was gathered and feeling satisfied or not. But something had shifted in her after standing at that pond the evening before, after the news about the Haverfield birds, after the quiet certainty that had begun collecting itself inside her chest. She wanted numbers now. She wanted to know exactly what she had. She took her almanac down from the shelf above the dry sink, a battered thing, 2 years old, its margins already crowded with frost dates and planting notes and the price of flour at Cartwell Crossing. And she opened it to the back pages, where a few blank leaves remained. She made a small grid in pencil, date across the top, eggs gathered down the side. She was careful, methodical, the way she had once kept sums in her father's dry goods ledger as a girl. By the end of the third day, she brought the almanac to the table after supper and set it open between them. He leaned in. He read the numbers twice. Then he sat back and looked at her. 11 birds. 3 days. The count was higher than either of them had expected. Not by a small margin, but by enough that he asked her to walk him through the tally again, wondering if she'd doubled something by mistake. She hadn't. The numbers were plain. He had heard plenty of talk about laying hens, about milk yields, about how many pigs a good bottomland farm could carry. He'd worked alongside older men who measured everything and forgot nothing. But for ducks, in his experience, ducks were utility birds, hardy and agreeable, not celebrated for their output. 11 birds producing at this rate, steadily, without faltering through the heat of July, was something he couldn't easily account for. They talked it through, the way they always did the things that mattered, slowly, circling back, testing each other's reasoning without arguing. He mentioned the feed, the marsh grass along the pond's edge, the insects that gathered under the lily stems at dusk. She agreed those were part of it, but she kept coming back to the water itself. She described what she had seen at the Haverfield place and what she had seen at their own pond. The clear water, visible through the stems, the way the surface stayed cool, even on the hottest afternoons when the valley shimmered. The lily cover kept the sun off the water. The water stayed cold. Cold water stayed clean. Clean water kept the birds well. Well birds laid steadily. He listened, without interrupting, his hands flat on the table, looking at the almanac grid. He didn't argue with her reasoning. He couldn't find the flaw in it. What he found instead, sitting there in the low lamplight with the almanac open between them, was something quieter, a dawning respect for what she had been watching all along. He rode out the next morning while the dew was still on the grass. It wasn't a long ride to Cartwell Crossing, perhaps 4 miles by the wagon track, a little less if you cut through the low draw and followed the creek bed north. He had made it dozens of times for feed, for nails, for whatever the season required. But he had not made it lately with a question in mind that felt this specific, this urgent, this much like something he needed to hear confirmed by another voice. The settlement was quiet at mid-morning. A freighting wagon sat unhitched in front of the general store, its team tied to the post and drooping in the already building heat. He nodded to the freighters and went inside, bought a small sack of salt, and asked the storekeeper if old Wes Parnham was still around most mornings. The storekeeper pointed toward the livery without looking up. He found the old man where he usually was, on a 3-legged stool just inside the livery door, mending a length of harness with the slow, unhurried hands of someone who had stopped being in a hurry decades ago. Wes Parnham had been in the territory since before the war, had run chickens and ducks and geese at 3 different homesteads before settling finally into Cartwell Crossing, with nothing to his name but a good memory and a reputation for knowing animals. He sat down on a low crate nearby and asked his question plainly. No preamble, no apology for it. He asked what Wes knew about ducks and water. The old man kept working the harness, but he answered without hesitation, as though he had been thinking about this very subject, and was glad to finally be asked. He said ducks were not difficult creatures if you understood what they needed, and what they needed, above all else, was clean water. Not just water, clean water, cool water. He said he had seen flocks on warm summer ponds that looked like they were suffering through a fever. They wouldn't lay, they'd lose weight. They'd wade in and wade back out again, and stand at the bank looking miserable because the water was no relief at all, just warm and thick and fouled by the sun. He said a duck laying well was a duck comfortable in her water, and a duck comfortable in her water was a duck whose pond stayed out of the direct sun and ran cold from a good source. He said it simply, without drama, the way men who have watched animals for 40 years tend to say the true things, quietly, as if the truth itself needed no embellishment to stand on its own. He thanked the old man, tied his salt sack to the saddle, and rode home. The sun was lowering behind the western ridge by the time he came up through the draw, and saw the homestead below him, the cabin, the barn, and beyond it, the pond, its lily-covered surface catching the last orange light, like something steady and certain waiting for him to arrive. He came home that evening quieter than usual, but it was the quiet of a man who has been given something to think about, rather than the quiet of worry. She noticed the difference. She had learned to read the particular quality of his silences, the way a person learns to read the sky, not by studying it, but by living under it long enough. He told her what the old man at the trading post had said. She listened without interrupting, her hands still around her coffee cup, her eyes on his face. When he finished, she looked out toward the pond, though it was dark by then, and there was nothing to see but the absence of light where the water lay. She said, "The eggs." He looked at her. She said it again, not as a question this time. The eggs. They had more than they needed. They had known that for a few weeks already. The flock was laying with a consistency that had caught them both off guard, and the surplus was stacking up in the root cellar, in neat cloth-wrapped rows, faster than 2 people could use them. She had been turning it over quietly, the way she turned most things over, waiting until an idea had enough shape to hold. She proposed bringing eggs to the general store at Cartwell Crossing, 2 dozen to start, enough to test the water without risking the inventory they had. The storekeeper there, a compact and cautious man who had been in the territory since before the war, was not known for enthusiasm. He was known for practicality, which she thought might actually work in their favor. Her husband agreed without argument. He trusted her judgment in matters of trade and people. She had a way of reading what a thing was worth before anyone else had put a price on it. So she went on a Tuesday morning, with 2 dozen eggs wrapped in straw and packed into a wooden crate, riding the mule into Cartwell Crossing, while the air still held the cool of the night. The storekeeper looked at the eggs the way he looked at most things, with careful, unhurried skepticism. He said he couldn't promise anything. He said eggs were eggs, and people bought what they needed when they needed it. He set the crate behind the counter with no particular ceremony, and told her he'd send word. Word came before the week was out. A boy rode out from Cartwell Crossing on a Thursday afternoon with a folded note tucked into his shirt. She read it, standing in the yard, the afternoon sun warm on her shoulders. The storekeeper's handwriting was spare and practical. Like the man himself, sold out in 1 day. Please bring as many as you can, spare each week. Will pay fair price. Let me know your quantity. She read it twice. Then she walked to the barn door and called to her husband, who was inside, mending a collar hitch, and she read it to him out loud, word by word. He set down the collar hitch and came to the barn door, and she read it again from the beginning, and when she finished the second time, neither of them said anything for a moment. The afternoon light lay across the yard in long, unhurried stripes. He took the note from her hand and looked at it, though she'd read every word. Then he folded it back along its crease and handed it to her, and the look on his face was the particular kind of quiet that comes not from having nothing to say, but from having more than words can easily carry. She was back at Cartwell Crossing the following Tuesday with 30 eggs. The week after that, 36. Word travels on the frontier the way water moves through dry ground, not all at once, not evenly, but eventually into every low place. By midsummer, a handful of families had begun asking for her eggs by name, sending notes of their own with the boy, or catching her at the store themselves, shaking her hand with the particular warmth of people who have found something reliable in an unreliable country. Not everyone received the news with such warmth. Aldous Birch said what he thought plainly, as was his habit. He said it at the feed store, loud enough for whoever happened to be nearby, that a man who let his pond go to weeds and sold duck eggs as though they were something special was either simple or trying to make a fool of his neighbors. He said lily pads were not a farming method. He said he'd seen better-kept puddles. He was not a cruel man, exactly. He was the kind of man who had built something solid and took that solidity as evidence that his way of seeing things was correct. He did not say these things out of meanness so much as out of a genuine inability to understand why someone would do otherwise. She heard about it second-hand, as one hears most things in a small settlement. She did not respond to it. There was no response worth making. What she did instead was trade. A freighting crew came through in late autumn, moving supplies down toward the rail connections, and their outrider had a dozen young ducks in a crate he was willing to part with for a fair exchange of eggs and a small amount of dried corn. The birds were lean from the journey, but sound, and she looked each one over with the eye she'd been developing all summer, checking for clarity, alertness, the small signs that told her whether a bird would thrive. By the following spring, the flock numbered 34. They moved around the lily pond in the mornings like something unhurried and deliberate, as if they too understood that what grew there was worth keeping. The freighting crew came back through in early June of 1872, and this time they were not passing through by chance. Word had traveled the way word does in country where news moves with wagons and riders, slowly but reliably, and their foreman had heard about the eggs from his outrider, who had eaten 3 of them fried over a campfire the previous autumn, and apparently had not forgotten. He came to the cabin door with his hat in his hand, and a directness that she appreciated. He wanted 2 dozen eggs per week, consistent, through the freighting season. He would pay in coin, not trade. She did not show how much that offer meant. She quoted him a fair price, neither too low nor too high, and he agreed without haggling, which told her the price had been fair. The second order came from farther away and arrived by letter. A hotel cook in Laramie, who had sampled the eggs through an intermediary and written with careful, deliberate penmanship to ask whether a weekly shipment could be arranged to come down with the freight wagons already making the route. The letter sat on the table for an evening while they talked it through. The distance was real. The arrangement depended on timing that was not entirely theirs to control. But the flock was healthy, the laying was steady, and the pond, entering its second full summer, was greener and more completely covered than it had ever been. The lilies had spread until they touched the far bank, and the water beneath them stayed cold even in July. She wrote back and said yes. She kept her tallies in the back pages of an almanac she had carried since Kansas. Columns of dates and counts, careful figures that she added each Sunday evening by the window while the light held. That summer, the columns grew. She watched the number climb toward a figure she had written in pencil at the top of a page in spring, circled it, and left it there as a kind of quiet promise to herself. In August, the columns reached it. She told him that evening after supper. She did not make ceremony of it. She simply turned the almanac toward him across the table and set her finger on the circled number, and then on the current total beside it. He looked at the page for a long moment without speaking. The following week, he rode to the land office. It was a 2-day ride each way, and she watched him go from the edge of the pond in the early morning light, the ducks moving quietly around her boots in the shallows. He came back on the 4th day carrying a folded document sealed with an ink stamp. 160 acres, their names written in a clerk's careful hand. He set it on the table between them without a word. He set the folded document on the table between them, and neither of them touched it for a long moment. She finally reached out and smoothed one corner flat with her thumb, reading the words again slowly, the way you read something you have wanted to read for so long that you are not quite sure it is real. Their names, the acreage, the recorded filing number, a clerk's neat stamp at the bottom. 160 acres, made certain. They slept soundly that night for the first time in longer than she could easily recall. What remained of the egg money, once the filing fee was settled, was not a great sum, but it was enough, and they had learned something about enough. He rode out the following week to speak with a man at Cartwell Crossing, a carpenter named Josiah Webb, who had built the addition onto the dry goods store the previous autumn, and was known for square corners and honest timber. The two of them stood at the cabin's east wall for nearly an hour, measuring and pointing and kneeling to check the grade of the ground. She watched them from a distance with her arms folded, not wanting to interrupt the conversation, but close enough to hear the low murmur of it. They broke ground on a Monday. The sound of it changed everything. Hammer blows rang out across the valley in the cool morning air, and she found herself pausing at whatever task she held to listen to them. There was something almost musical about the rhythm, the steady knock of wood meeting wood, the rasp of a saw, the occasional voice of one man calling to the other across the frame. The ducks, for their part, paid the noise no particular mind. They moved along the near edge of the pond in their unhurried way, dipping and rising, occasionally lifting their wings as if stretching. She stood at the water's edge one afternoon and watched the new walls rise above the roofline of the old cabin. The framing was still bare, pale timber bright against the sky, but already she could see the shape of what it would become. A room with 2 windows, space enough to stop folding herself small around every task. She had not known how much she was waiting for that until she saw it taking form. The lilies had begun to fade slightly at the edges of their blooms by then, the way they always did when summer began to lean toward its end. The pond still lay cool and green beneath them. The flock moved through the shallows in the long amber light of late afternoon, and she watched them the way you watch something you have almost lost and didn't. She was not sure she had the words yet for what the lilies had given them. She suspected she would need a little more time to find them. The harvest social came on a Saturday in late August, held in the yard behind the Cartwell Crossing feed store the way it always was, with long tables and lanterns strung on wire and the smell of wood smoke threading through the cooling air. They drove in on the wagon with 24 eggs packed in straw and a quiet sense of having earned the evening. It was Aldous Birch who came to him first. The big rancher moved through the crowd with a certain deliberateness, the way a man moves when he has decided to do something uncomfortable and intends to finish it before he loses his nerve. He shook the husband's hand and said, plainly enough, that he had been watching what came out of that pond valley all summer. Said he had a question, if it wasn't impolite to ask. He wanted to know whether there were any ducklings to be had come spring, and whether a man could get a start of those lilies without killing them in the moving. 2 other families approached before the evening was half done. A woman from the settlement, who had called the pond an eyesore, stood beside the table, with her hands folded, and asked quietly whether the lily roots were difficult to transplant. She did not apologize for what she'd said before. Neither of them required it. The wife answered her honestly that the roots wanted cold water and patience and not much else, and left it there. By the time the lanterns were fully lit and the fiddle had started up, 4 separate people had made inquiries. They wrote nothing down. They would remember. On the drive back, the valley opened ahead of them, dark and familiar, the pond catching a faint silver from the quarter moon above the ridge. They unhitched the horse and walked together to the water's edge, without quite deciding to. The flock had already settled. 34 birds arranged themselves in the shallows and along the grassy bank with the unhurried certainty of creatures that know they are safe. The lily pads floated in the darkness, each one a quiet shadow on the still surface. He stood beside her and did not say anything for a while. Then he said he supposed the neighbors had come around. She nodded slowly. He asked her, not for the first time but meaning it more now, what had made her so sure. She was quiet a moment, watching the flock. Then she said she had never been sure. She had just never been able to see a reason to fight the lilies. They were already here. They were already doing something. She had only needed to wait long enough to understand what it was they were offering. The pond lay still around them, green-edged and full, holding its cold water gently beneath the dark sky.